During the height of the pandemic, you probably noticed that a lot of streets and parking lots look kind of like this, which is to say, empty. The lockdown and stay-at-home orders led to less people moving around, and that meant less cars on the road. An unintended consequence of these empty streets is that they helped to create the largest reduction in CO2 emissions in history. According to a report released by the International Energy Agency, 2020 emissions were down 6% from the previous year. Now, 6% might not sound like much, but it's the largest relative drop since World War II, and it represents almost 2 billion tons of emissions being taken out of the equation. The report explains that the majority of this decline was from lower oil use for road transport and aviation. So less cars on the road and less planes in the air means less emissions. That makes sense. But streets and parking lots don't really look like this anymore. They look a little bit more like this. Traffic has returned with all of its usual banes, including a return of emissions. While yearly emissions were down for 2020 as compared with 2019, monthly emissions helped paint a more nuanced picture. Emissions were down in the beginning of the year, but as time went on, they began creeping up, eventually surpassing the previous year's emissions by 2% for the month of December. You also might be able to correlate this graph with the return of traffic in your city or town. With the return and increase of emissions, our global goals of carbon neutrality and reductions are looking less plausible. The IEA report I mentioned goes into detail about how emissions are returning due to a lack of focus on sustainability when it comes to the economic recoveries put in place to deal with the fallout of the pandemic. Basically, we aren't globally prioritizing green recoveries. This can be seen most clearly by a recent estimation released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. To limit warming to the best case scenario, that is at or less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. According to the IPCC, we're currently on track for just a 0.5% reduction by then. That's a reduction 90 times too low. Now, we are never going to be able to have empty streets forever. But moving forward, we can prioritize pushes to electric vehicles and transitions from carbon-dependent electricity grids to carbon-neutral ones. Despite the absolutely immense destruction that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought, it has also given us the largest drop in carbon emissions ever. Now it's up to us to fully recover from the economic setbacks of the pandemic in sustainable ways that continue the previous trend of decline. And that's a trend that's going to at least have to continue every year up until 2050 if we want any hope at meeting our best case scenarios for climate. We're already falling back into old habits, but the reliance on carbon producing fuels is one that at some point we're going to have to break. Hopefully, much, much sooner rather than later.